The U.S. says it believes China conducted a secret nuclear test in 2020, and President Trump reserves the right to follow suit as the New START arms control treaty signed by President Obama is allowed to expire. Meantime, the Food and Drug Administration summarily rejects an mRNA flu vaccine from Moderna, but then under pressure, the FDA changes course.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's opinion pages, editorial board member Kate Odell and columnist Alicia Finley. The United States conducted its last nuclear explosive test in 1992 underground at the Nevada test site. President Clinton then signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in 1996, but it was rejected by the Senate and never ratified. China similarly has signed but not ratified that treaty, and now the Trump administration is saying in no uncertain terms that it believes Beijing has recently done nuclear testing. Here's Assistant Secretary of State Christopher Yaw speaking last week at a Hudson Institute event.
As shared in Geneva, the United States government is aware that China has conducted nuclear explosive tests, including preparing for tests with designated yields in the hundreds of tons. China has used decoupling, a method to decrease the effectiveness of seismic monitoring to hide its activities from the world. But the United States is paying close attention, and we are aware that China conducted one such yield-producing nuclear test on June 22nd, 2020. I have personally examined the data, and I concur with the United States government assessment in this. As the president has said, the United States will return to testing on a, quote, equal basis. But equal basis doesn't mean we're going back to Ivy Mike style atmospheric testing in the multi-megaton range, as some arms control folks would have you believe, hyperventilating about this issue.
Kate, China may have denied any nuclear tests took place, but how do you read the importance of the Trump administration going public with this information?
Let me try to set the table on this a little bit, because I think this is a really important conversation that the Trump administration is driving. I think the public may view nuclear weapons as sort of anachronistic, and most of our conversations about warfare now focus on evolving technology and not around the American nuclear deterrent. And what the Trump administration is basically doing here is, I think, raising the profile to the public that the United States has, for the first time, two nuclear adversaries, two nuclear competitors in Russia and China, which is novel in U.S. history. And the Chinese Communist Party's nuclear breakout has been described by a former U.S. flag officer as breathtaking. Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, in our pages recently called it a strategic earthquake. And you really do see the Chinese Communist Party starting to build far more nuclear weapons than they need just for a minimal deterrent to defend themselves or prevent themselves from being attacked. In 2020, the Pentagon estimated that China had 200 nuclear warheads and would grow to 400 by the end of the decade. 6 years later, the Pentagon says that China has 600 nuclear weapons now and is going to reach 1,000 by 2030. And so we have consistently underestimated the ferocity of this nuclear breakout. And so this test needs to be viewed in the larger context of, we have expiring arms control agreements with Russia that have attracted a lot of public tension that, oh no, the world is going to revert to a more dangerous place because we don't have arms control. When in reality, China was not ever in that agreement and represents the biggest percolating nuclear threat to the United States. And so this test might seem like small news, but it really deserves more attention, as I think the administration starts to tell the public about the way the nuclear threats to the United States are changing.
Dig in a bit on that expiring agreement. That is the New START nuclear arms treaty. It was signed between the United States and Russia by President Obama in 2010 and expired earlier this month. How does that expiration fit into the broader picture we're talking about and the Trump administration's strategy on this?
Well, I think the Trump administration was correct to let it expire. The world looks much different than it did in 2010. for all the reasons that I described. Then that the chief shortcoming of it is being that China was not a party to it, does not have to comply with any of the verification. Their buildup is quite opaque, and we really don't. They don't even declare it. We don't have much information about it. The other reality being that Vladimir Putin's invasion into Ukraine, I think, made extending that unrealistic. And at this Hudson event that we just listened to a piece of, the State Department's Christopher Yaw thing, I thought did a helpful description for people who are listening. Basically, if you think about a little chart in front of you, and at the top it says Russia, China, United States, and on the side it says strategic nuclear weapons, large nuclear weapons, and then it says tactical nuclear weapons, which might be used on a battlefield. You had only 2 of those 6 boxes checked by this arrangement with Russia. You had only constrained the U.S. and Russia strategic warheads, and that is also relevant again, because I think some of the biggest nuclear issues percolating right now involve that box I just described, called battlefield nuclear weapons that you might use in a conflict that are of lower yield. The New START treaty, when the Senate ratified it, it wanted the government to work to get to more agreement with Russia on constraining their battlefield nuclear weapons inventory, but that never happened. Instead, what happened is that the U.S. complied with the general sentiment, and it also, after the Cold War, dismantled a lot of its battlefield nuclear weapons capability. But the Russians did no such thing. They have as many as 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. This is an oversimplification, but they sort of develop a missile and make it nuclear capable. They have more types of missiles that they can put nuclear weapons on. And so it left the New START paired with the Chinese nuclear breakout, just left enormous vulnerabilities for the free world. And really, the United States was the only one constraining their arsenal, while its enemies continued to kind of pursue what they perceived were their own nuclear interests. And that's the core reason why it's not worth renewing. And any deal, arms control deal worth having, would have to be 3 ways and discuss the tactical nuclear issue.
So what does an update of the U.S. nuclear deterrent look like? And maybe that involves more underground testing, like we're potentially talking about, if the Trump administration is reserving the right to match what China, it says, did in 2020. Or maybe it is just rebuilding and modernizing the nuclear triad. What's in progress, and where do you think that the Trump administration ought to really put its focus?
Well, one thing I'll say is, when New START was ratified, John Kyle, a Republican at the time, drove a pretty hard bargain to force Barack Obama to modernize America's nuclear deterrent. And that was crucial. And that modernization of all 3 legs of the triad is ongoing, but there are open questions about whether we've designed that nuclear modernization to account for just these percolating, expanding nuclear threats. And so one crucial question is whether the United States is going to buy enough B-21 bombers. It would be a miracle if they bought 100, but that seems like the absolute minimum for just that, how many targets the United States needs to be prepared to hold at risk to deter. There's an ongoing discussion about whether our ballistic missile submarines that are now being replaced to the Columbia class submarine, whether they need more missile tubes on them to account for what it's going to take for America to deter its nuclear threat. So I think the test, we should talk a little more about the details of the test or what the State Department is saying here. But it does really suggest that nuclear modernization for the United States is not just a housekeeping project. It's actually an essential, and continuing to fund that, all 3 legs of the triad, while meeting some other defense commitments that will require increased defense spending. There's really no way around that. But one other, you were asking about, what should the president really be focused on to mitigate some of these threats? I think one that really needs the public's attention is something called the Sea-Launched Nuclear Cruise Missile. When in the jargon we call it SLCM-N. And this is a weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon that's under development right now and might join the US forces in the 2030s. I don't think that is quick enough, and here's why. The risk from tactical nuclear weapons is, imagine a scenario like this. The Chinese Communist Party decides to provoke a crisis for control of Taiwan, and it could immediately try to wield its nuclear arsenal to deter the United States from intervening in that conflict. And that's not fan fiction. Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, every time the West has tried to proffer some new missile or system to Ukraine, Putin has used his own nuclear arsenal to saber rattle and suggest that, he might retaliate and use nuclear weapons. And I think the Biden administration was frightened by that. And so there's this nuclear blackmail playbook that's getting written right now by Russia that China is certainly paying attention to as it thinks about its own ambitions in the Pacific. And I bring up that weapon, Slick-M-N, because deploying it on American submarines would give a U.S. president options to respond to a threat like that. And so Americans, I think, instinctually understand that they don't want to be held hostage in a crisis like that. They want to be able to defend U.S. interests on the merits and in their own judgment, and not have a hostile adversary saying stay out of the Taiwan Strait or else. And so this particular nuclear cruise missile, it is an urgent project that President Trump could pour more money into to speed it up. The Biden administration tried to cancel this program. The Trump administration has revived it, but it still is years away from being deployed, and that is a vulnerability. And like I said, that's a core example of this specific nuclear problem that is percolating on battlefield nukes.
Speaking of the defense budget, President Trump has also talked about missile defense, and sometimes he calls it a golden dome. What is the importance of that project in the context of this conversation we're having about the increased nuclear threats from China and Russia?
Well, Golden Dome is essential not just for nuclear threats, but conventional threats too, because I think there's compelling evidence that if the United States gets involved in another war, the U.S. homeland will be vulnerable, and in any number of ways, not just to missiles, but cyber attacks. And so a Golden Dome is a valuable project because it's what people call in the jargon de-escalatory. Because if he were to attack, not only is he going to provoke a retaliation, but missile defense means maybe that attack won't succeed. And so Golden Dome really is a worthy project for the United States, not just at the nuclear level, but also, there's increasing homeland vulnerability to cruise missiles from Russia or China. And many of the things that we might use in Golden Dome are valuable battlefield interceptors that we don't have enough of anyway. So it's not just, additive, just not just additional. It actually connects with essential ways that we already need to increase our own munition stockpiles, defend ourselves better. Some of those weapons have currency with Golden Dome. But I think it's one of the open question really, though, is, again, we have a nuclear triad that needs modernizing. We have conventional force shortfalls right now in one of the carriers parked outside of Iran has been deployed for 10 months. There's a lot of conversation about it, whether it has readiness issues. I say that we have conventional shortfalls, we have nuclear modernization we need to do, and Golden Dome is an ambitious project. And so that suggests that the current level of effort that we're spending on our defense, about 3% of the economy, is not sufficient to meet all of these needs. And so I think, Golden Dome is just one of the ways that we're going to have to increase the public level of effort. And I think talking more about the ways our adversaries are trying to take nuclear advantage over us is important for the public to understand, and building a case for spending that money, even in a fiscally constrained environment in the United States.
Let's turn to the latest drama at the Food and Drug Administration. Moderna, one of the makers of a widely given COVID-19 vaccine that used mRNA technology, had applied for approval of a new flu vaccine. And this month, the FDA rejected that without even reviewing it, sending the company a refuse to file letter with Vinay Prasad, the FDA's chief vaccine regulator, complaining that Moderna had not done what he called adequate and well-controlled studies. Let's start with FDA Commissioner Marty Makary on Fox News last week, explaining his view of this controversy.
This is part of the normal dialogue. There's been some misnomers here. This is not a reversal of the FDA. When we send that letter out, it's after a preliminary review of the application. The scientists said, you did not follow our guidance in designing this trial. And they said in its current form, it's headed towards a non-approval. So the company came back and we had the healthy dialogue that we should be having with companies. We should partner. I'd like to see this get approved if it proves to be safe and efficacious. There are other concerns that people have had with this vaccine. So we have to take a close look.
Alicia, what do you make of that explanation? Not a reversal, normal process, healthy dialogue between the FDA and these regulated companies?
Well, I think Dr. Makary is kind of hiding ball, as he often does on these issues when there's been a blowback to something that his hire, Vinay Prasad, has done. Now, let's backtrack a little bit. Vinay Prasad, who's the head of the biologics and vaccine division, he has openly expressed hostility to these vaccine products and has said that they should have to qualify or show much higher standards. There was a lot of reporting that actually the FDA staff wanted to review the mRNA vaccine for the flu, and that Dr. Prasad overruled them. And issued what is known as a refusal to file letter, which occurs after there isn't a preliminary review. Basically, they may have looked at the file and said, well, usually in these cases, it's like there isn't information that's missing, like some very rudimentary information. Here, like the file or the application was complete. He just didn't like how Moderna conducted the trial, even though the FDA reviewers, before Moderna embarked on this trial a couple of years ago, had signed off on it. And now the quibble that Dr. Prasad raised in his letter would usually have been maybe raised during the actual review process. And the quibble is this. The Moderna used as its quote-unquote placebo or control group a standard dose vaccine for those over age 65 when they should have used a high dose vaccine, because that is what's recommended in the US. Now, the problem with this, and for Moderna to do this kind of trial, is that it was a global trial. And in most countries outside the US, in which it was conducting this trial, a high dose vaccine was not available. However, it did submit evidence, immunogenicity evidence is the term for it, that in this patient population, the over 65, that they actually produce higher antibody levels to the flu for its vaccine versus a high dose flu vaccine, which is suggesting and indicative that it is more efficacious. So I think Dr. Makary is speaking out two sides of his mouth here. He realizes that the decision got a lot of blowback. He was actually reporting says that he was hauled into the president's office after this came down, because there was a lot of unhappiness and scolded by the president. And so now he's talking or he's trying to at least try to placate the White House by walking back this reversal and say, okay, we will review it after all.
Alicia, what do you make of the health gains that are potentially on the table here? My understanding, some of the reporting is that the typical flu vaccine is about 40% effective. And I'm no physician, but just from reading about it, it seems that part of the difficulty is that the flu mutates very rapidly, and there is a pretty decent production lag on typical flu vaccines. So it's always a game every year of predicting which strains are going to be circulating, which strains are going to be out in public, the things that people are going to be actually catching when they're in contact with other people who have the flu. And one of the amazing things about this mRNA technology potentially is it's pretty fast. You can change the coding in the mRNA vaccine extremely rapidly to take that into account. So is the promise here potentially a flu vaccine that maybe has a shorter lag time, that has better coverage, that does a better job of protecting not only average Americans who go get a flu vaccine because they don't want to be sick for a week or two, but people who are in high risk populations, older people who are, who are maybe facing more serious complications?
Well, I think that's exactly the hope. In its clinical trial, it showed that it was about 27% more effective against symptomatic illness than a standard flu vaccine, about 49% more against hospitalizations. Now, I think where Dr. Prasad is coming from here, based on his writings, academic writings as well, 50% improvement on something that's low 40% really is only like makes it 60 or 70% effective, and therefore there's only a marginal benefit, which I think is wrong. And on a population, an aggregate level, there could be huge benefits. And we also have to keep in mind that the flu doesn't just knock some people out for a week or two. It actually increases heart attacks and strokes among people who get ill, especially those with other kind of comorbidities. There have been studies that have shown that it increases strokes and heart attacks by 5 to 6 fold, which is one reason why you see heart attacks and strokes spike during the winter months. I think the one other potential benefit from the vaccine is it could also just be more, or the Moderna vaccine is it could also just be more durable. And that's been a problem with the standard flu vaccines or even the high dose flu vaccine is they wane within a month or two. So if you get a flu shot in, say, October, it doesn't really get you through the whole flu vaccines. You know, if there's another wave that hits in February, you're still going to be vulnerable. So the idea is with the Moderna shot, it actually produces higher levels of antibodies that are more durable and could actually last an entire flu vaccine or flu season.
Alicia, the other unseen effect that I think is worth talking about is just the signal that the FDA is sending to other vaccine developers, other pharma companies. Some reporting I've seen suggests that Moderna has spent hundreds of millions of dollars testing this flu vaccine. It did a study enrolling 41,000 people. And given that the longtime view of, I think, Republicans is that we want more drug development, more vaccine development, it's a little bit odd here to be telling a company who it seems thought it was following the rules of the road for what it needed to submit this kind of application that, nope, we've now changed the rules of the road. I mean, what a message from the FDA.
Well, I completely agree with that. And Moderna, by the way, had some other flu vaccines in trials that those didn't pan out. Actually, only about 10% of vaccines that enter clinical trials actually end up succeeding. And that doesn't necessarily even ensure commercial success. For instance, right now with the RSV, an issue with the RSV vaccines that were developed, there are now three players in that market, including Pfizer, GSK, and Moderna. And Moderna is struggling because it was the third last company to enter the market, so it has not had a huge uptake. So vaccines actually tend to be low margin products anyways, and this just throws another kink of uncertainty. The president of Moderna actually said that we do not foresee beginning another phase 3, which is the last phase 3 trial, owing to this regulatory uncertainty. It's actually been clipping and curbing some other vaccine and other clinical trial programs because of reduced cash flow as the uptake of the COVID vaccines has waned. So it's really been having to prioritize its investments in areas that it thinks are most likely to pay off. And the result is that you're already seeing less investment in vaccines. But I think this is actually a bigger issue out beyond the vaccine market. You're seeing you're hearing a lot of companies, rare disease developers, say that their treatments were rejected after the FDA moved the goalposts on the clinical trial design that the agency had earlier blessed. notwithstanding what Dr. McCary is out there saying, oh, we're doing all these things to help companies get or approve rare disease drugs faster, and we're being more flexible. Well, they're out doing the absolute opposite behind the scenes. And then a lot of this goes back to Vinay Prasad's opposition to these kinds of treatments because he thinks they're too expensive. And he thinks that they are driving up healthcare spending. And so he wants to create and use the FDA as a kind of rationing body by limiting their entry into the market.
Thank you, Alicia and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.